very brightly colored and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while.
We want to be free to do what we want to do.
Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barker, the president of Hell's Angels.
This is 1095. Hey Mel, how you doing? Good. Well, good evening. I was going to say good morning because it's morning here, but yeah.
Great. Good evening, good morning. I'm good. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm glad we got on. We've had a few techie issues trying to get ourselves on a podcast, but yeah, I've been looking forward to chatting. I'm maybe 2/3 of the way through your memoir. We're obviously going to talk about that. Maybe just before we do, just a little bit of background for our audience. You know, yourself, where you're at, and where you're based, what you do, and all that stuff, and then we'll get into some of the book.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I'm in Shelbyville, Kentucky, and I'm actually on our main street right now, so you may hear cars going by that will give evidence to that. So obviously, I'm a writer, just published my first book in May and do some local writing here as well. My husband and I have developed some real estate in our town here downtown. So we have some Airbnbs. We're like multi-space Airbnb hosts. And so raising two girls and just doing the small town life with those people.
Cool. Busy. And this is your first book, or have you written books before? Is this the first book? I'm into it. I didn't look up whether you'd done other books, but yeah.
Yeah, it's my first book. It is. It's the one that's been inside for so long. So I finally pushed it out, and we'll see what happens from here in terms of another one. Cool.
So it is a memoir, and it is very much a memoir in terms of it's you know, it kind of jumps a little bit in terms of going back and to when you were younger, and then obviously, you know, your where you're at now, the things you've gone through. I don't want to explain what I think the theme is, but it's called Eclipsed. Maybe you can talk about the title. What is the title? Yeah. Because it obviously is very relevant to the content and the theme of the story.
Right. You know, I was just kind of walking around in my life, and someone said to me, if you could describe your life in one word, what would it be? And I'd never thought really about this word at all, but the word eclipsed just bolted out of my mouth. And I think I startled both of us. And so I just kind of sat with it for a little bit and realized, so the word eclipse means to disappear and to fade away. No one ever would have looked at my life and used those words to describe it. But because I was out in the forefront, we live in a small town, right in the middle of town, like smack dab in the middle of town. I'm from a big family. I'm outgoing. No one would say, oh, she's fading away. But the reality is there were so many things out in front of me that didn't feel like the real me. And I was sort of behind that, tucked behind in the shadows. So the book is called Uneclipsed because it's about the process of coming out from behind those different shadows, be it, you know, fundamentalist religion, addiction, different relationships, the need for approval and expectations, and sort of finding my way back to my true self.
Cool. Excuse me, I said eclipsed, uneclipsed, of course, which is which is an interesting because within that is part of the story, right? It's a book about transformation, right? It's going through a journey. There's a part that I just read actually that it really kind of struck me. What I thought was interesting, which was, and I'm going to paraphrase this because I might get on, but your daughter was taught. I think you just tried to write the introduction, or you were trying to write some words. You were trying to get into your book. And let me paraphrase this as I remember it, and if you can remember the exact words, please say it back. But your daughter kind of said something along the lines of, you know, hey, mummy, stop trying so hard. You just got to kind of, you know, go with the flow, go out, have a run, just let it come to you, blah, blah, blah. For anyone who's, I write, I do a fair bit of creative stuff, and it really jumped out at me on the page. I thought I'd really like to just talk about that in a little bit more detail. Maybe you can do a better job than I just did in explaining that moment. So, yeah.
I think she was 10 at the time. I don't know. That's my youngest, Annie. She's got this wisdom that just, I don't know. She's like, she hasn't forgotten where we came from yet, or the source. She seems to, it seeps out of her. So yes, I was totally stressed and I couldn't eke out these words. And she said, just stop. She's like, I can't believe I have to tell you this. You're running towards it when really you just need to stop and take a run and get some good food in you and let it come to you. And I thought, where has she been on my whole life? Like, this is what I've done my whole life. You know, we strive, we go, we pace, we go for it. We're panting after it. And if we would just stop panting and actually take a deep breath, it can come to us.
There's so much wisdom in what she said. I was really interested. I mean, that must have kind of struck you. It's not something that people don't say a lot. I mean, it's not an uncommon approach to creativity, but for a 10-year-old to kind of come out with that in the car, I think she was, yeah. Is that a common, do you often get kind of advice from your kids in that way, or?
Both of my kids blow my hair back with the stuff that they say. And I feel like Celia, my oldest, will remind me of things that I know, and Annie will remind me of things I have forgotten. So it's kind of like that. But they're little mirrors. You know, and I want to actually, that's one thing I wanted to say when we were talking about how my book is so much a memoir. It is, I think when you write a memoir, it's not just to say, hey, this is about me. It's hopefully to say, like, hey, here's part of my story. And hopefully it holds up a mirror to let you see parts of your own story. It gives you a window inside of my story so that you can also maybe find some reflection of your own self in it. So.
Did you have was there a kind of light bulb moment when you were like, hey, right, I've got to write this. I kind of, you know, I know it all, the book's there in my head and I've got to get it out? Or was it more of a journey in terms of the process of getting it down on paper, or something different? Yeah. What was, when you think back on writing it, talk us through some of those experiences in that process.
Well, it's so interesting. I sounded like, when I first thought about what I wanted to write, it sounded like almost like just too general, almost like, you know, find your true self. And who's not? I mean, everyone seems, that's almost trending right now. It's just it's almost ridiculous. So I started just to stop writing for an audience or toward anything. And this is when it all flowed, which is maybe why my daughter remembered that. But I just started to let myself free write. And then I took a look at, over the course of probably 3 weeks, I didn't have any intention. And I looked at what rose. And I said, hey, when I sit down at, 6 o'clock in the morning and I have no audience and no one's interrupting me and it's just me and the quiet, this is what keeps rising. And so then I sort of came up with categories without trying to, like, what is it that I am eclipsed by? What are these foreboding shadows that are in front of me? And then from there, those were easy to name. Once I said, these are the shadows that I'm hiding behind, I kind of lined those culprits up. And they're not all culprits, right? I willfully went behind several of them without even being asked. But then I sort of had those categories. And then I thought, what have I already written over the years that might be a start to something? And then I sort of started to fill those buckets, fill in those categories with anecdotes that seemed to fit the bill and sort of explain where I was coming from.
Cool. There are themes that stand out in the book. Religion, booze. I think you call yourself in your profile. What do you? A former booze enthusiast. Actually, there's not. I mean, I'm only 2/3 away, and you don't really go into that so much. Actually, the kind of, But I mean, actually, let's talk about that piece now, I suppose. So you call yourself that in your profile, so it's obviously a prominent part. Yeah. But I don't know if you go into it in the book much. I haven't really got to it. There are bits when you touch on kind of losing yourself in red wine occasionally. And was that a long time before writing the book? Is it a kind of, when you say a former life, are we talking years ago? What?
I've been sober for 5.5 years. Okay. So it's, I kept some of the things that were the more, like there's a bulk of things that people can readily dig in and identify with, especially women readers, I would say. And so some of those things that maybe were not as universal, although I think we all have addictions of some sort, those are sort of at the end. And so there is a whole, there's a whole section there's a chapter called How It Happened. Okay. And so the tricky part is there's a really thin line between ritual and dependence. And for me, I crossed it. I mean, just crazy how I went from having a glass to, at one point, I thought, well, I'm having several glasses. Maybe I'll just have just 2 glasses. But then as soon as I decided to have 2 glasses, I found myself at the store buying the biggest glasses there were, still. And then I took a look at the recyclable bins one week, and there were 7 bottles of wine after 7 days. And I was the only wine drinker in the house. And that just escalated and went from, Merlot to Tito's and so on and so forth. And then we opened a bar, and we lived right upstairs from it. So, it was when I looked back and said, I may have crossed the line. The line at that point was way, way back behind me. But the trickiest part was, and I've only been to like 2 AA meetings, but there's one of the steps is just to admit that your life had become unmanageable. But mine hadn't really become unmanageable because I'm a manager of things. I can manage my stuff. And so I would do all the things, it'd fall apart at night, but man, 5:15, I was up and tick, 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 tick. And so I made sure there was no evidence that I was crumbling on the inside. And so, as addicts, we first just have to sell a bill of goods to ourselves, and then it sounds like truth to everybody else. So I think that I was in trouble for a long time before I let myself wave the flag of defeat. And then I knew I had a problem still for several months and was open with myself about it before I said, and now it's time to do something about it because it's terrifying.
Sure. And the way you describe that, and look, when you look at alcohol problems, they are framed in, I think, the mind of the person who's drinking, right? Some people will drink X and it's a problem. Some people will drink XXX and it's a problem. Some people will drink XXX and it's not. It just depends. But interesting the way you frame it. You got everything done, and then you'd have a drink at the end of the day. Was it, I sit down and almost the reward system of, right, I've done everything, I've got everything done, I'll have a drink? Or was it just the routine of I've had anything, or a bit of both?
It was a routine. I was definitely going to have the drink, or 4. It's usually 4 strong vodka tonics by the time it was over. But yeah, all the things were done. I wasn't missing anything. And then as soon as I crossed that finish line, so I became very, very efficient. Yeah. And so I got all my stuff done and then checked out.
And this was a while before you wrote the book, right? I don't know how long it took you to write the book, but
right. No, did it? So pieces of the book had been written, but no, it wasn't like I'm going to write the book.
I suppose the reason I asked that is because I was going to say, was there a noticeable influence, either positive or negative? I'm assuming positive, but in terms of the creative process, writing, obviously having more time, because when you're sitting down and having a drink, you're going, I've done the things I'm doing. I'm now in kind of being mode rather than doing mode. But were you conscious of that influence? Did you find you just, hey, damn, I could get up at this time, I could be creative? Yeah. Any kind of links there?
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting when I would drink, I felt like that opened up a portal. And so that was scary to put down and wonder, well, then what will come out? So there had to be a clearing. There was a process. But then writing was a huge part of my sobriety, tracing the roots of the why that got me to cross in the first place. And then I sort of purged all that. And after working through all of that, then again began the rising. It was like all of it. It was how I found my way back to myself. And so I had to find a new way to open the door. But then once I did, it was easy to walk through it. And that was just going into the inner terrain, connecting with God or the divine, and not being afraid to go through. So
cool. Maybe a good segue, as you mentioned, God and the divine. Obviously, the 12 steps is religiously related. I understand. So I'm at a point in your book. I know we just chatted before. I haven't got to the kind of last section where you talk about, I suppose, if I phrase this correctly, the importance of spirituality in your life now. A lot of what you're talking about, where I've been at the beginning of the book and the middle of the book, is kind of you growing up with God you're in the Bible Belt, right? So in the very kind of structured, pretty full-on religious elements of Middle America. And I'm not someone who's been there, so I'm coming from a someone who might know from TV. But yeah, maybe it'd be good to just unpack some of this stuff. And yeah, it was something I get a sense there isn't a positive framing of it in terms of growing up. It was just something that was in your life, as it must be for many people. But clearly that has completely 180'd in terms of where it is now, right? In terms of how that fits in your life, God and spirituality.
Yes. I don't really have, I've been able to work through some of there was a space where I would say I dwelled in some cynicism. I wrestled even with a little bit of anger with church. But the reality is I had a lot of really good experiences and really well-intended messages. And I think the thing for me is when you start, like scripture even says, like, come unto me like a little child. So the thing about when you're a kid, you have all this wonder and awe. But what happened in my church experience, because of how I'm wired, this may not happen to everybody, but I'm wired to, I'm going to get an A in the class. So I show up with all my awe and wonder, and I realize within the construct of church, oh, this is like a thing. There's a formula. So I need to do that right. There's like an algorithm. So algorithms and awe don't typically meld, right? It's either one or the other. It seems like I don't like to think about things in terms of like binary thinking, but it does really feel like if there's an algorithm involved, it kind of usurps the awe and the wonder. And so I started to peer behind the curtain and think, who is turning this crank, and what is that for? This doesn't feel like the kind of experience that I have when I'm in nature, and you can't really replicate that in church. But and then we began to travel, and you start to encounter other ways or other people or other postures toward God. And when you encounter, you can't just categorize and say, oh, it's not us and them anymore. It's just us. And so that will wreck you if you are in the formulaic structure of confining God to a certain way. And so much of my faith was predicated on fear. And so much of my worship experience was predicated on production. And all of those things, I don't think anybody sat down and said, let's scare them and then be theatrical about it. It's just sort of the part of the machine. And I eventually had to detach from the machine to remember why it's ever in place to begin with. And so it's just, I haven't thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I just got out of the tub.
Yeah, right. This is the challenge with, I don't know if it's challenge the right word, but, kind of organized religion. And I've had no exposure to the Bible Belt in the US, but I know a bit about it, and I have had exposure in different ways in other parts of the world. But yeah, the problem is when you question, you got God here and you got spirituality here, and like you say, spirituality is linked to everything. God is part of this structured in a Christianity sense. I mean, part of this structured religion. When you question any of it, and there is a formula, then there is a fear creeps in terms of, am I questioning something that's big and almighty here? Whereas it sounds to me like you've reconnected with what was important in a more, I suppose, wholesome and holistic manner. Does that mean now, do you still go back to the same types of churches, or is it just God is now something in your life in a sense that is more big to your own experience?
I would love to be able to go to church and have talks. Like I do see a spiritual director. I was talking with her today, and, I'll have a conversation with, a friend of mine or a friend over here. And I think I would go to this, I would show up to this, or I'll listen to like a podcast. There's a gentleman named Richard Rohr, who is a contemplative. He's a Franciscan priest, and he completely expanded my heart, where a lot of my friends that are cradle Catholics, they feel that constriction in that faith, but he was Catholic and like, whew. And so it's not like I go, well, they're wrong, or I can't do that, or I can't go to church there. But I do feel like for me, just in this particular season of life, and it may be different one day, when I go, I feel, and I actually use this analogy in the book, and it's a me thing where I show up and I feel sort of like I'm in a wool turtleneck in the dead of July. I just can't breathe. But I also don't want to roll up in there and like throw a hand grenade in the congregation just because I want to be disruptive or a contrarian. That's not what I don't want to evangelize this way either. I just want to, if I could go to a place where there was like holy curiosity about things like, what about the mothering heart of God? Like, can we maybe just unpack? Like, I just want to talk about that, but that's not really happening here that I know of. And if it is, I'd love to know. I'd love to be there.
Yeah, this is the difficulty, right? When you got this thing called God, whatever that is, which is, I think, a personal experience in many ways, and then you've got all these different, constructed religions to represent that in different ways, and then people are like, no, it must be this way. So it's not a, who knows? Not here to solve the religious problems of the world, but yeah. I mean, getting back to the book, so are you planning another book? Is it a memoir and that's it? Put it away, pack it away. You've said what you want to say to the world, or what are the aspirations for more writing?
It's interesting when I was writing about the things that I've been eclipsed by, the way where I put like the church stuff mostly and the faith stuff was under the bucket of tradition. What I found when I went to edit is that, wow, that's a really full bucket.
Yeah.
I could write a lot more about that. And so I do feel like if I write another book readily, like in the next couple of years, it will be more of that space of exploration and holy curiosity. What about this? Have you considered this? Posturing different positions. I think that would be a fascinating book. That would be a project that would be researched, and it'd be a totally different thing. I also think it would be interesting to maybe 10 years from now go back and write another now then memoir. Like, here I am now. Yeah. Like, where are they now? And that was actually my mom's idea. She was like, I'd love to read this book in 10 years, like your next book in 10 years about these same positions or these same subjects with that, a decade later positions. I think that would be a curious thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. The first thing you said there, that's the key difference, right? And you write a memoir, the research element of a memoir is ultimately an introspective, internal research, whereas the moment you step outside and start to look at subject matter that's related to many others, that's the interesting part. Then you can research in terms of, interviews and everything else. So, yeah. I
think that'd be fun.
I mean, before actually, I had one more question, but I was going to ask if you had any advice to other people who wanted to write their first book, write a memoir specifically. Before I ask that, is there anything I haven't asked you about the book that you'd like to talk about? Anything you'd like to share that I haven't asked you about?
No, I think, one thing is I would want people to know, I didn't, it's a memoir, but it does talk about different things. Someone said, it's like, you're like sitting across from, a big sister or a best friend. But what I would love to say is, just because I write about my sobriety experience or where I am now in my faith or any number of things, I never want to come from this place of like expertise. It's, I just feel like I write as if I'm sitting across the table having a cup of coffee with someone. So that is also what I would say is the trickiest part about starting to write, is people always say, well, know your audience. Speaking of fine lines, there is a hair thin line between writing like to an audience and writing for an audience. And if you're trying to tell your truth, it can be a snare if you're always thinking of your audience, because what could creep in is, what would they want to hear? What might play better if I say it like this, or if it's like that? So for me, I would say, a really good writing practice is key. And so giving yourself permission to just free write without censoring yourself. There's a book called The Creative, what's it called? The Artist's, it's Julia Cameron, The Artist's Way. And she talks about writing morning pages. I think that's such a gift. It starts to just generate in you this creativity and this connection to, your creativity, and then make that just a solid practice and protect that. But then also give yourself permission to, I love just generating prompts, but not like questions. Like that's not my jam to be like, where will you be in 5 years? That totally works for someone. But if you just start like, I remember, and then you just let yourself write, it's so interesting where your own mind and heart will actually take you.
Yeah.
And so if you just kind of follow your soul and then just pay attention to what continues to rise, and then maybe those things that continue to rise, maybe that's what you write about. Maybe that's where your writing takes you. And don't be afraid to write a lot and only use a little, because it's like mining for gold.
Cool. That's really good advice. If you give me the link to that book, I'll put it in the notes for anyone watching or listening. And I think what's nice about what you just you hinted there really to what your daughter said, which is just sit down and kind of write and just let it flow, right? Don't worry too much about, of course you got to know your audience, but if you get too caught up in that, you're writing for them rather than a place from authenticity is what I kind of heard you say then. So
yeah, right. Exactly.
Cool. So where do people find out more about you? How do they connect? How do they read up on the book or buy the book? Do you want to leave some details here, which I'll also put in the notes for anyone listening or watching?
Yeah, sure. So I have a website, melindamhardin.com. And then on Instagram, same thing, just straightforward with my name, Melinda M. Hardin. On Facebook, Melinda Hardin. 502, I'll link all of that. You can get the book on Amazon and, of course, local bookshops here if you're from here. I've also been doing some like online book clubs on Zoom and coming and speaking to women's events and recovery groups. So I'd love to do more stuff like that. It's really fun to connect that way.
Cool. Awesome. Well, yeah, hopefully anyone listening, get in touch and order the book. Uneclipsed, not eclipsed. Uneclipsed. And yeah, look, it's been great to chat. I look forward to reading the last kind of third of the book over the next week or two. So cool.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks, you too. Good morning. Have a good morning.
Cheers.
We want to be free to do what we want to
Two were
do.
Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barger, the president of Hell's Angels.
This is 1095